start the recording. So yeah, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is dialogues about how do we build a more empathic society and culture. And I'm here with Jacob. Would you pronounce your name? Introduce yourself. Maybe just introduce yourself so it makes it a little easier.
I'm Jacob Israelashvili. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I recently finished another postdoc at the University of Amsterdam, and I study the core features that makes us human, our ability to care for others and understand other people. Just to give you more background.
Yeah, and I see your research, so it's been about empathy. You've done multiple papers on empathy on your website, on your faculty page. It says, my research examines the empathic process that antecedent understanding and caring for others. And you co-authored a paper called Different Faces of Empathy, Feelings of Similarity, Disrupt Recognition of Negative Emotions. And that's just one of many papers that you've written about empathy. So we wanted to talk about that paper, just, hear what your the paper was about, what your findings were, and maybe just discuss it a bit. And so I think what you're in the paper, you're looking at some things that actually block empathy and that empathic connection. So just would love to hear, more about your research, how it went. And
so let me just flesh in a bit of context. So as you know, humans made it to the moon, but sometimes we still find it difficult to reach out to others and understand the person standing next to us. And in order to bridge this gap, my research looked into the psychological processes that anticipates caring and understanding of other people. Previously, before coming to the University of Amsterdam, I developed the idea of empathy as felt toward people with whom we share similar experiences. So this notion turns the concept of empathy and similarity into more dynamic and situational concept. So it's not only toward people which are members of our own group, but also just people that share a day-to-day difficulties that we all have in life. And it highlighted a very simple yet powerful insight that sharing experience with another person can be the beginning of what might later develop to be a meaningful relationship. And in this project that you referred in the paper, Different Faces of Empathy, what we wanted to find out is that we know that sharing experience with another person really create a psychological bond, and we feel more concerned toward others that share similar experiences to us. But we wanted to understand to what extent also these shared experiences allow us to understand their subjective experience better. There was not much research about it. We know that shared experiences are a component and consequences of empathy, that once we have this psychological bond, we feel shared experiences. But to what extent sharing experience with another person really give you a valuable insight into their situation. So we are familiar with this phrase, I know how you feel, I've been there too. It's like a common way to communicate empathy. And in a nutshell, it holds a really important idea that you have some relevant information about the situation of the other. So it's not only in your head, just imagining, trying to understand the other, but you actually know relevant information about the situation.
You've had sort of the visceral feeling that person is having. So if they have a certain type of pain, having lost a family member, you've lost a family member, and you sort of have that experience, visceral experience.
Exactly. And those shared experiences really cause us to tune into others. And what the research do you want me to jump straight to the findings?
Whatever you feel like you'd like to express.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that the first challenge that we had was to try to come up with a more complex way to understand what it means to understand others, right? Because there are plenty of measures out there. Most of them use static pictures. So in the empathy tent, I saw on your website that there is this how good are you in understanding others, and there's the reading mind in the eyes test about poem. So those static expression posed by actors in usually a stereotypic configuration of the facial expression of specific emotional states, and those type of measures to study emotional recognition are very important. But still we know from research that what happens in real life is that there is a lot of contextual information that helps us to understand the emotional states of the other person. So sometimes as we now have this conversation, we just see each other's face, but in many times throughout life, so we see the people and we see their body posture and we see the situation, and we can connect the dots and understand, maybe they feel happy because they just, I don't know.
We have the context.
Yeah.
Maybe you have more of you have an image of the context that they're in.
Yeah, and we started to think about the context also as having not a isolated single scene, but just having the entire story, the emotional event, and the way that it's unfold as giving the perceiver contextual information to understand the other person. Another thing that we wanted to incorporate into this measure of understanding others was to try to think about understanding others as the ability to identify multiple emotions that might be involved in the emotional states of the other person. Because in other projects about the way that people speak about the language that people speak about their emotions, what we observed there that when you ask people to describe their feelings, many times they use multiple emotional words in order to describe the same scene, the same event. It's barely just one single emotions that captures the complexity of the subjective experience.
So people have multiple emotion, different feelings, various feelings, and the feelings are changing kind of from moment to moment as well. So it's sort of a dynamic, multifaceted experience that we have is feeling with a feeling, sort of a feeling landscape maybe.
Yeah, exactly. And all these classical measures of understanding others usually just focus on one scene or one expression, and we wanted to be able, building on these important works, previous works, to add the complexity of emotional understanding. So what we did was asking people simply to share, genuinely share emotional experiences they have had in their life. So people told us really fascinating stories. Some of them were dealt with difficult situations. So a sick parent, difficulties communicating with a family, signs of partner cheating, and all these day-to-day events that occurred in people's life. And we videotape all these stories. Each one lasted for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we asked them to watch themselves in the video, and then rate the extent to which they felt embarrassed, 0 to 6, afraid, anger, rage, disappointed, and all this, a range of 10 different negative emotions. Later on, what we did was we showed these videos to 800 participants, and
800?
800 participants.
Okay, wow. Mm-hmm.
So it was really a large-scale study, and we tested different aspects of this phenomenon. With the simple task, try to just listen to this person sharing a story with you and try to understand their emotions. So by comparing the ratings of the perceivers of our subject with the emotional rating of the targets, we could calculate the extent to which people really were accurate in identifying the sadness, the embarrassment, the fear, all these emotions encapsulated within each emotional event. So we use this paradigm, and in order to see to what extent feeling empathy toward another person really facilitates our ability to understand the emotions of another person. And when we refer to empathy, we try to probe two different psychological processes that associate with empathy. One of them was the spontaneous felt similarity in experience. So to the extent that people have had similar experience in their life, and we simply ask them, to what extent you have had similar experience as narrated in the video. And the second process that we try to explore in this study is the instruction to focus on the perspective of the other person. So we know that this phrase that you can't really understand a person until you walk a mile in their shoes. And it's commonly believed that by trying to put yourself in the situation of the other person, you can understand them. So we instructed part of the participants to, before watching the video, to try to take the perspective of the other person. But in fact, there are, in the literature, if you read it, so there are two separate ways to take the perspective of the other person. One of them is try to focus on the perspective of the other person. So that's what people refer to as other focus or imagine other. The second version of trying to take the perspective of the other person is referred to as imagine self or self-focus, and that is the instruction. When you listen to the other person, try to put yourself in their situation. Imagine how you would feel if you were in the situation and the situation had happened to you. And in general, the findings in the literature is that the instruction to imagine yourself in a situation results in a more intense emotional reaction. So our hypothesis was that if we instruct people try to focus on the perspective of the other person, they will have a more accurate understanding of the other person's experience, compared with the instruction to imagine yourself in a situation, or with another control condition that we had, which was just no instruction at all, just participants watch the videos. And what we consistently find across the 4 studies in this paper is that the instruction to take the perspective of the other person did not improve the accuracy. So without having any new relevant information, just trying to take the perspective of the other person, participants achieve the same level of accuracy as people that did not receive this instruction. We can get to discuss the explanation of this finding, but the more interesting, in my judgment, was the unpredictable and negative correlation between having had similarity in experience and the accuracy with which people were able to understand the emotion of the others. We thought a priori that having relevant information about the situation, because you have had a similar experience, would give people a more solid basis in order to decipher the subjective experience of the other person. In fact, what the data consistently show was that people that had similar experience, most of them, and I emphasize the most of them because there are nuances to this finding. Most of them were less accurate. And then we tried to understand what was there. How could it be that it happens? Maybe it was just a result of the specific stories that we collected in the United States. So we collected new stories from participants in the Netherlands, and again asked them share emotional story that you have had in your life. And we repeated the same procedure, and again we found the same, exactly the same findings, that having had similar experience was associated with the lower understanding of the other experience. So
okay, can I just recap just so I make sure I understand. So you've got someone telling a story, and then someone is watching that story, and you're trying to find out how accurately are they sensing the emotional state of the storyteller. And then you're setting up the, you're asking the listener to take different approaches. One approach is just imagine you're in that situation, sense the feelings that you have in that, and then what are the feelings? And then you're kind of measuring how accurate is what the person is saying to what the person, thinks that they're saying. And then the other is that's sort of imagining yourself in that situation. And the other is, well, imagine you're that person in that situation. What feelings are you feeling? And your findings are that both of those states are not really, they're not accurately matching what the storyteller is actually saying. There's sort of a disconnect in terms of the emotional state. That's kind of the broad essence of what I'm kind of hearing and understanding. And you're kind of curious, well, why is that?
Yes, so what you just said, that's the description of our attempt to understand different perspective-taking instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And we study this, try to imagine that the situation happened to you, or try to focus on the other person, or just gave no instruction. And all these three different conditions led to similar level of understanding the other person. So the instruction that the participant received before watching the video had zero impact on the actual understanding.
Oh, uh-huh. And they had three options. One is imagine self, imagine other, and then just no instructions.
Yeah,
uh-huh.
yeah. And aside from it, after watching the video and rating the emotions that they see in the targets, we asked them, to what extent do you have had similar experience?
Mm-hmm.
So irrespective of the instruction that we gave, we just know to what extent each perceiver mentioned that they have had similar experience or not, and we asked them also to rate the extent that this experience was familiar to them, from low to high. And then we can statistically tease apart the contribution of each different component. And what we found was that the more people have had similar experience, that they mentioned that it's happened to them, they were actually less accurate in understanding of the other person. And we were really unexpecting these findings. And then we decided to go beyond the replication with different stories generated from different countries. We decided to do another study and try to ask people to report the emotions that they feel toward the storyteller. So after you watch the video, I ask you, to what extent do you feel sympathetic, concern toward that person? So we ask them to rate emotions that are conceptually represents the notion of empathic concern, emotional concern. And also we ask them to rate the extent to which listening to the story caused them to feel discomfort and uneasy and distress. So we presented them with this list of emotions, and they rated to what extent they felt essentially concerned to the other person and distressed by listening to this story. And what we found was that participants that have had similar experience as the other person rated that they felt both more concerned toward the storyteller, but also more distressed by recalling this negative experience from the life, because they listen to the story, and now all of a sudden they recall that they have this problem communicating with the family, or concern about the relative that is sick, and it's really apparently recalling this personal experience with the negative situation cause people to shift their attention from the storyteller inward and try to think about their own
experiences and dynamics and everything that's coming up. They're shifting, instead of being focused on what's going on, the emotional state there, they're shifting to their own personal constellation of feelings that are arising.
So referring to your earlier, to your opening sentence that similarity in experience or empathy disrupt recognition. So I think that I would phrase it a bit differently, to the extent that it's too much and people cannot prevent themselves from re-experiencing the distress, then we found that this shift of attention from the other person to yourself and feeling overwhelmed and stressed, this caused people to miss the subjective experience of the other person. But what we also found was that for those participants that were able to accommodate this feeling of distress while listening to the other person, from them, having had similar experience was actually associated with better understanding of the other person. So,
so if they don't go into personal distress or sort of overwhelm, then they can use the insights and the experience to more accurately perceive what's happening with
because having a similar experience causes people to feel more concerns toward others, and the feeling of concerns causes people to focus their attention on the other person and motivate them to help them. We know from other studies. But it's this ability to regulate your own negative emotional reaction toward recalling the negative situation that you have experienced from your life. So that's like
that's it in a nutshell. So how well can you, these experiences, how well can you regulate them without them sort of taking over your awareness and your attention? And if I guess you didn't go into how you regulate your own awareness or any, it's just kind of, is that, did you go?
Yeah, so it's one of the future programs now, but they are, if you look into the literature on emotion recognition, so they are a validated way to down-regulate negative emotions. So usually the suggestion is to tell people, try to tell yourself whatever helps you to think about the experience of the other person as less aversive, less negative. We haven't done it yet, but yeah.
Well, the work I do, you know, I've been working on this about 12, 13 years on the topic of empathy, and I found the sort of active listening, empathic listening, which you get from like the work of Carl Rogers. You know, of listening to someone and doing a reflection of what you hear them say to their satisfaction is sort of a really good way of practicing that accuracy, that empathic accuracy, because you get sort of a feedback like, oh, I'm hearing you're curious, or I'm hearing you're upset, or that you're sad. Is this true? And, that's what I'm hearing. And then you get a confirmation. No, I'm not really sad. I'm kind of more angry, for example. So, oh, it's anger. So it's a way of, so that's like another method of sort of directly empathizing with someone. Then there's these other things, sort of these imaginative empathy processes too. So I don't know, have you looked at that? Like I mean, it's hard to do a study with 800 people where they're all doing empathic reflection, on one storyteller. So it'd be a hard thing to set up. But, I mean, that's another sort of empathic approach to see how accurate people are with using active listening or empathic listening.
Yes, I'll tell you three things. First of all, I've been following a little bit your work, and I'm really inspired by your commitment and your contribution to put really empathy in the center of our discourse. So thank you for all your efforts.
Thanks for that. Thanks for mentioning that.
Thank you for bringing Carl Rogers, and also more in general on the literature from the clinical psychology. And what we know from Rogers, also from Kohut, is that the attempt to understand the other person from a therapeutic standpoint is even more important than the actual understanding of the other person. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that you actively listen to the other person, and that person, he or she feels that they're worth your time, they're worth your listening, you respect their perspective, per se, can have.
Oh, lost the camera.
If we can fix it.
Okay, I just had a little hiccup there with your camera. So yeah, you were just talking about there's, in terms of maybe a sense of connection, that it's just having the intention, feeling the intention that someone is interested in who you are and is trying to understand. It's not so much just the accuracy of how well you are understood, but just that you're trying is a big component too.
Yes, so of course, being accurate understanding for the other person is very important if you want to help them. So you need to understand them, but the mere attempt to understand others is very important for creating a meaningful connection with the other person. And we know also from other studies that we did that people that report that they care about others, they have like empathic tendency to trying to understand others, to care about others, also are better at understanding their emotions. So by even if you don't understand the emotions of the other person currently, by being committed to the attempt to understand the other person, you are more likely to end up with calibrating your perspective and understanding of the other person. And the third thing that I thought of when you asked if we do something about it, so now at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, we've just been trying to do that to kind of simulating in the lab what happens when in the field you sit with others and actively listen to them and reflecting on what you understood. So what we did was provide, after we asked participants to listen to the emotional stories of another person, we provided them with feedback about the actual emotions that the target, that the people in the video actually felt. And then we asked them, okay, now listen to another story and try to understand the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we give them feedback that allow them to calibrate the emotional nuances of the subjective experience that the other person felt. And what we found that by providing this feedback, participants became better at understanding the emotions of others. So by actively listening, as you said, and reflecting and learning about the actual emotions that another person felt in the situation, what the data shows is that people are better at understanding future emotional experience of the same person. So I really support your actual efforts to.
Do you have like a percentage of this? Like, are you 10% better? I mean, just, generally, do you get 20%? You know what I mean? Is there how much better do people get? Is there, I mean, I don't know if that, how easy that is to measure, but.
yeah, you can calculate how much people became better, but it always depends on the specific task. So I can tell you that the effect was moderately strong. So by intervention of 1 minute, 10% of the participants became better at. I need to do this exact calculation, but it highly depends on how you measure the accuracy. Sometimes it's from 0 to 100, and then you can say they became 10% better. But I haven't done the math yet.
Okay. Well, another question is, from looking at the, field of empathy, it gets so confusing with definitions. Maybe like Dan Batson have laid out at least 8 ways that people are sort of using the word. And for me, empathy is about sensing into the other person. Like you're saying, you're trying to get accurately sensing the felt experience, sort of moment to moment that the other person is. And then, the academics talked about, affective empathy and cognitive empathy, which I find very confusing, actually. And I think the word imaginative empathy, right? You're saying you're imagining self in other, that there's, I like the term imaginative empathy, that you can imagine yourself in different perspectives and what is the felt experience of that. So I'm just wondering, what do you, if you're using the term empathy, how are you sort of working with that? And like the word, empathy, cognitive empathy, affective empathy, I just find that even within academia, those terms are used differently. Sometimes cognitive empathy is sort of the map that you've created in your head, and sometimes it's used as imagining, perspective taking. So even that seemed like a big mess. There's no, in terms of, agreement on these terms.
Yeah, you nailed it down. There's really a big confusion about the definition of empathy, and you refer to this famous chapter of Batson from 2009. This thing's called empathy, a different phenomenon. Simply put, I think that empathy is taking a moment in which you see another person and not look over them. It's not being a selfless, but I would say a blackout of the self. So a moment in which you are really listening to the other person. And throughout the history, from a century ago, that the concept of empathy was introduced into the English language, and the focus on the more cognitive, the understanding part, or the more affective, the caring part, really changed back and forth. Around the 80s, that there was some unifying approach that we're just going to refer to it as a multidimensional phenomenon. And I actually started to read all this literature about empathy, and I was a bit confused because at the early ages, people had a core dimensional definition of empathy. So it was either about trying to understand the other person, or about the emotional response toward the suffering other. What happens at the 80s with the multidimensional definition of empathy, that the literature kind of stood back from trying to say something about which component is more dominant. And we did a study that tried to address this question. I do agree, of course, that empathy is both caring for others and understanding others. But what we were interested to know is to what extent empathy usually starts with the attempt to understand others that later leads to caring for those people because you understand their perspective, or it's the other way around, that we try to care about others or feel some emotions towards them, and then we try to understand their perspective. So you can think about Baron-Cohen definitions of empathy as a leap of imagination into the other person's headspace, as representing the dominancy of the understanding part, the perspective-taking part, the cognitive part. And you can think about the other definition of Hoffman and Eisenberg and others as representing the emotional response to the suffering of the other person as something that cause empathy to elicitate. And what we found was that empathy usually starts with emotional response toward the other person that later may or may not develop into the cognitive attempt to understand their suffering. And we looked about across different nationalities, and men and women, adults and teenagers, and the patterns were quite robust. That the emotional response toward the other person, it's usually what causes empathy to start. And within this emotional response to the other person, there are these two different type of emotions. So there is the concern for the other person, the empathic concern. There is the personal distress. Empathic concern is the extent to which I care toward the other person, and the personal distress is those feelings of uncomfort and distress by the sufferer of the other person.
Well, I know there is also often they talk about empathy, saying, "Oh, there's this suffering," and there's also there's any number of responses to perceiving the state of the other, right? But everybody, the academics seem to concentrate on the suffering part or the concern, because you can have joy, you can have celebration, you can have curiosity. I mean, there can be any number of responses to the state of the other. So it's.
I totally agree. The majority of the literature, empathy focus on the sufferer of the other person. I think that Daniel Batson was very strong about it, that the empathy invoked by the sufferer of the other person. And I think that the literature followed this focus, but I completely agree that it's not necessarily related only to the sufferer of the other person. So if a child, if my child will show me like
you're a new parent,
just draw, and I will say, "Wow, this is really wonderful."
You celebrate their curiosity and their creativity and their own celebration. Yeah, you've got that joy response. Exactly. I can see you lighting up.
Yeah, I think that you tap into the difference between empathy and sympathy. So sympathy is bounded with the sufferer of the other person, but I think the empathy is more broad. as you refer to it, as the ability to share emotional states of the other person. And this states is not necessarily negative. It's not only all about the suffer. And Zakai and Moriel have a work about a positive empathy, and it's definitely an important part of the story. Yeah.
Well, I see your passion, your curiosity, so your dedication to working on empathy. How did that start? I mean, kind of personally, like what was your history of getting so passionately interested in this topic? I mean, you're doing, your whole PhD, your studies. I mean, that's a lot of energy and effort into this, and curious how that developed.
So it happened step by step that my understanding that it's really, as I said, one of the core features that makes us human. And when you read the literature, you see that this, even that everyone agrees that it's super important, still no one knows really how to define it well and how to promote it, and etc. So I think that from a more intellectual perspective, it's like that. They acknowledge that it's very important, but also not that well understood. But more from my personal life, I was privileged to know several very empathetic people in my life. But I was also had the experience of in a very apathic people in my life. So I think that I was inspired by the ability of really empathic connection with another person to really transform people's life. And,
so you had empathic people in your family, in your community, or wherever. You just saw that how that was a contribution. That sort of inspired you just to see the beauty maybe of the connection. I'm kind of putting words in your mouth.
And really the tremendous impact that the empathic connection with another person really can transform people's life.
So it kind of how it contributes and their lives become better, I guess, in transforming. Yeah. Well, the other part, I've got about 10 minutes. I don't want to keep you over the time. I don't know how much time you have, but the in terms of the studies, from the work I've done with empathy, I find that, this mutual empathic listening, like, Carl Rogers had empathy within the therapeutic, right? The therapist only does listening, but to bring that into a mutual listening. So I do something called empathy circles, which is small groups, 2, 3, 4, up to 6 people in a small group doing empathic listening with each other. So it's just not a therapist and a client. It's peer-to-peer, human to human, sort of relational. And I find that that's kind of one of the most, easy ways to get started with sort of practicing empathy, because you're reflecting, someone gets a chance to speak, they get heard, and then the listener gets a chance to speak and they get heard, so it goes around. So I don't know if you're doing any tests, it'd be great to have some tests on that to kind of show the effectiveness of that process. I found that sort of the most effective is with learning that practice. I can listen to someone who's maybe in distress or needs to be heard, and kind of offer one-to-one empathic listening to them. Or in a group, we can kind of support each other, with this empathic listening. It's sort of a first step. And then for conflict mediation, I found it's like the essence of any kind of conflict, that you listen to one party, they're really upset maybe, and it kind of helps them kind of calm down because they finally are heard and understood. You listen to the other parties, and then you bring them together to kind of hear each other. And it's, it takes a lot of time. It's hours of, talking and working through these issues. But it can lead to, deeper connection and having that basic structure. And so, I'm trying to promote, we need more kind of studies that kind of validate that. I think would be really helpful to say, hey, when you do this, it kind of works, and kind of why does it work and stuff.
So we can definitely think about how to incorporate some research into the wonderful field work that you do. You are doing the hard work. I'm doing the easy work, just sitting and writing. But I'm pretty much convinced that the core ingredients of what we know from research that promotes caring and understanding, those core ingredients exist in the work that and the intervention that you do. So I believe that it can also be tested and put into scientific study by sitting with the other person and listening to the other person. You communicate a deep sense of respect, deep sense of similarity. From the literature, we know that I think the best answer for what makes people feel empathy toward the other person is what David articulated as Mark David articulated as the perceived similarity. So to the extent that you perceive the other person to be similar to yourself, any outcome to the other person is experienced to some extent as an outcome to the self, good or bad. So by sitting together with other people and communicating that your story, your perspective is important, I have a genuine care and respect to your perspective, the same as I have my own perspective. I value your own opinion, and I'm here to listen to it. So you're already putting yourself in the position of assuming that the other person is similar to yourself, has a valuable opinion, and also perceive the other people perceive themselves in positive terms, the same as you perceive yourself as a positive person. So they don't just do.
They're not cutting each other off. They're willing to, yeah.
Yeah, they do. They actually think that what they say and do is good.
So it's sort of like you're saying that just being willing to sit down and talk with each other and hear each other is just that itself is already a very positive forward step.
Exactly, because it puts you in the mindset that we all share same basic positive tendency.
Well, it could be that we all share an attempt towards deeper empathy, right? I value empathy, you value empathy, so we're going to have this value to begin with. So I see that as sort of a starting point as well. And actually, if we could have a cultural, in the Constitution, part of the society's value is empathy itself, is kind of what I would like to bring it into, a sort of a cultural value that we as a culture value empathy, and we want to promote it, in the culture and make it a societal or, social value, since you're in social psychology, we want to make this a social value. So where do you see your work going in the coming, months, years? Do you have a sort of direction?
So I would like to understand the strengths and the weaknesses of shared experiences. Wuz and I are open toward developing intervention that allow people to feel closer to one another and understand better each other. So I think that's the real goal, to achieve what you achieve with your intervention.
So you want to actually create some tools, some interventions that people can use. So, well, I'd love to keep the conversation going. I feel this is like the start. I really appreciate, all the work that you're doing, your intention, the dedication, and, I'd love to keep, in connection, maybe have some more dialogues, maybe bring some others together and actually try an empathy circle with some other, academics or authors, if you're open, have time for that. And
yeah, of course, I would love to.
Well, good. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been just really enjoyed it. Enjoy the energy you bring to it, and congratulations on your your child. I guess you had a new child. Is that?
Yeah. Actually, first daughter.
First daughter. Oh, okay. Congratulations on that. So, anything else in final conclusion that you wanted to say?
It was a pleasure, and I'm really will be happy to stay in touch and look forward for future conversation.